These series of videos are different things that I've published over the last few months that speak specifically to queer trauma, how it shows up in James Baldwin's life and artwork, how it's showing up in our contemporary kind of media landscape through celebrities or people like Pose, through the advent of shitty biopics and cultural erasure. So buckle up, it's gonna be a long video, grab some water, and thank you for taking this new format. For those that are newer to this channel, my name is Prince. I make videos about Black history, James Baldwin, anti-capitalism, the writing life, and much more. And I love educating people online. So thank you for watching. Enjoy the video. To start, I want to explain the basic situation. For those that don't know, the actor Billy Porter announced last year that he would be co-writing, lead acting, and co-producing a biopic about James Baldwin. James Baldwin is a famed writer that was born in 1924, is known for amazing books like Giovanni's Room, The Fire Next Time, Go Tell It on the Mountain, If Beale Street Could Talk. He's inspired documentaries like I Am Not Your Negro. And generally, James Baldwin is known to be one of the most prominent queer Black writers out there because he was so incisive about the civil rights movement. He was able to speak critically to the white liberal and moderate, and he also had a very particular and intersectional connection to the Black community. James Baldwin died in the 1980s, and near the end of his life, he was struggling with how to deal with the aftermath of the civil rights and Black power movement. Billy Porter is an actor that is notably known for his role on Pose, for his music career, for his flamboyant kind of presentation, non-binary identity, and generally being someone who's known as being like frank or can tell it like it is. And that has some issues in terms of this Guardian interview, which really went viral online and kind of exposed some of Billy Porter's overt Zionism. Let's just call it overt Zionism, because that's what it fucking is. It's Billy Porter supporting a genocide, or at least not knowing enough to speak on the fact that a genocide is happening while trying to portray James Baldwin, who was ardently against the project of Zionism.
If we were white, if we were Irish, if we were Jewish, if we were Poles, if we had, in fact, in your mind, a frame of reference, our heroes would be your heroes too. Nat Turner would be a hero for you instead of a threat. Malcolm X might still be alive. And everyone is very proud of brave little Israel, a state against which I have nothing. I don't want to be misinterpreted. I'm not an anti-Semite. But, when the Israelis pick up guns, or the Poles, or the Irish, or any white man in the world says, give me liberty or give me death, the entire white world applauds. When a Black man says exactly the same thing, word for word, he is judged a criminal and treated like one, and everything possible is done to make an example of this bad nigger so there won't be any more like him.
Billy Porter did an interview with the journalist at The Guardian. Those Friends people make $100 million a year. I'm getting 6-cent checks. It's not okay. Billy Porter on race, recognition, and the Middle East. And Billy Porter basically shows his ass as a queer capitalist who is sad about the writers and actors strike that recently happened. And so now he's doing a Baldwin biopic for a cheap fucking cash grab and awards grab. And one of the first quotes in the interview, in the third paragraph of this already, in case you're wondering, yes, this is basically how Porter speaks 100% of the time. Over the course of our 45-minute interview, Porter, compares himself with the 4-time Oscar nominee Viola Davis on 3 separate occasions. He punctuates his musings on a ceasefire in the Middle East with the word doll. What? And then we go down further into the interview. Porter says, our deals are going away, our jobs are going away, everyone's downsizing, but the people in the C-suite are still making money, he says. He's still frustrated that there's no accountability for the people who ran the business into the ground. Whose fault is it that the business can't sustain itself and is going to implode, he says, his eyes steely behind thick-rimmed glasses. Streaming destroyed the artist's ability to make money, our ability to participate in capitalism. Being an artist, we're always freelance and very often blue-collar. That it took so long for the streamers to negotiate terms with SAG-AFTRA, Porter says, has resulted in a shrinking middle class of working actors. Those Friends people are making $100 million a year, he exclaims. I'm getting 6-cent checks. It's not okay. What is extremely messed up about this portion of this interview is that Billy Porter is essentially equating his creative freedom to pursue a biopic about James Baldwin with the way that the elite have taken things away from working class actors in terms of the wages that they pay them. I don't think this is a fair equivocation. You not having money doesn't mean that you should make a bad biopic about James Baldwin. And a big thing that Porter kind of posits in this interview, and Porter talked about a lot during the SAG actors strike, is that a lot of actors don't make a lot of money. They make cents or dollars in their residual checks for films and roles. It's important for actors to have more autonomy and more stability. The reason that this is not the best thing to kind of talk about in terms of a Baldwin biopic is because you being poor does not mean you get to make subpar artistic choices that reflect badly on history because you need money or because you want to claim. James Baldwin was probably way poorer than you ever were and was supporting a family of 5 or 6 or 7 people. Still, Baldwin stayed true to kind of a moral compass that was critical of capitalism, had solidarity with people in other countries and other marginalized nations, and he was critical of how Hollywood and the mainstream tries to portray Black people. Goes on to say, now he's putting these skills as a screenwriter to work, co-writing a biopic based on the life of revolutionary writer and activist James Baldwin, in which he will also star. His motivation is simple. If not me, who? I've been sitting around and waiting for people to tell the Langston Hughes story, the James Baldwin story. Anyone Black and queer, as far as I'm concerned, I'm done waiting. I'll do it myself. The audacity, right? He says, who's going to tell it better than the Black gay man who embodies that in today's age? It's such an important story to tell, and I feel so blessed to be in this time where it will get told. Porter says that Baldwin's story could not have been told before this time because nobody gave a fuck, but that the executives are wiser now to the fact that stories catering to marginalized audiences can be hugely lucrative. Porter goes on to say, if there's green money attached to it, executives will care. That's always across the board, he says. As often becomes clear during our conversation, Porter seems to blah, blah, blah. And then Porter goes on to say, how do we on this end acknowledge that the color is green? It's not Black, it's not white, it's not yellow, it's not Muslim. The color is green. Not all skin folk are kinfolk. Not all Black queer people align in terms of how they look at history. Porter, you are a part of the artistic elite. Yes, you are struggling for wages and you're still Black and queer and you exist at these intersections, but you still represent a part of the elite. And so to equate yourself with James Baldwin, who lived on the margins, who traveled to other places, who lived with other people that were marginalized, talked to them, engaged in movements deeply on a political level, wrote journalistically, was incisive about the structural wrongs happening against us and how identity becomes a trap. For you to equate that with your modern contemporary art bourgeois bullshit journey to get your EGOT is ridiculous, and it is really fucking offensive in terms of James Baldwin's memory. And then for me to then turn it into this queer capitalism thing where it's less about representation and more actually about what kind of story you can tell in order to get executives to invest in your project. Where's the artistic integrity? That is exactly what James Baldwin was all about. So not only are you diluting and staining his memory, but you're doing it on a production level and on a storytelling level, I imagine. Because the color is green and that's all that really matters, right? And Porter goes on to say, Barbie is green. Greta Gerwig got all the fucking green. She can do whatever she wants because they want that. I'm trying to figure out for myself what this looks like because we have to understand too, it's a business, it's show business, and business is the bigger word. We can't lose sight of that. Also messy, meeting the demands of capitalism, which has already subjugated Black people and queer people in the first place in order to tell our stories. It's using the master's tools to escape the master's house. So maybe you don't read enough Baldwin, maybe you don't read enough Audre Lorde, maybe you don't read enough Black history, but you should understand that folding to the American project and folding to capitalism in order to tell a story in a diluted, butchered way, especially for a figure like James Baldwin, is fucking evil. And following the green, following capitalism is going to make you an enemy of your own community. Baldwin, of course, was a strong advocate for the right of Palestinians. Porter has been staunchly supportive of Israel in the past, opposing the cultural boycott of the film festival in Tel Aviv in 2021, and he was one of 700 celebrities who signed an open letter last year asking Hollywood to support Israel in its retaliation against Gaza. Later on in the piece, Porter says, First and foremost, I'm supportive of a two-state solution. The second thing is, this is not my hill. I'm not gonna die on it. It's not mine. I'm not Jewish, nor am I Palestinian. What's going on over there is horrific. The choices that we in America have made are wrong. Please don't make me a poster child for that. I don't want to be in the conversation because I don't know enough about it. I'm in support of my Jewish friends and my Palestinian friends, he says. It's a two-state solution that's been going on for thousands of years over there. I don't know, he says, letting out a nervous giggle. What I do know is that we don't need to continue bombing over there. I know we should stop doing that. I do believe that. And the Palestinians, not Palestinians, what are the people called who started this shit? The extremists. So bad. It's so offensive. Thousands of years, Israel was formed in the 1940s. The reason that this is so bad is, one, shows that Billy Porter is willing to be in direct political contradiction with James Baldwin, despite benefiting off of his legacy, despite wanting to quote James Baldwin during his speeches and award shows, which is an obvious sign of co-optation for the wrong reason. And then two, to speak on an ongoing genocide, where women, children, men are being bombed, tortured, starved, having aid taken away from them, being targeted and killed while they're receiving aid, having state powers all around the world collude to not give them the rights that they deserve as human beings, to not even read enough on this situation to accurately describe it, and then to speak on in an interview where you're saying, I'm not Jewish, nor it's such an old fucking head coon black people shit to say. It's basically saying, I don't need to care about what's happening over there. I need to worry about my own. It's so fucking selfish for someone like Billy Porter to say this, because you want other people to care about you and your identity and your history and your significance, yet you don't want to advocate for other people in other places that have way less than you and are dehumanized in ways that you can't even fucking imagine. How dare you? In the name of James Baldwin, you're a Zionist and you want to benefit from a film about someone who was a staunch anti-Zionist and supported Palestinian liberation? You're doing the work of white supremacy by not reading about history and then misconstruing it with your platform because it helps you fucking profit. The reason that this interview is so bad is because it is a clear sign of where we are in terms of queer people having ownership of our histories and stories. And this is what is messy about when elite art spaces and the bourgeois art spaces, there is still this active commodification of queer and radical history. We see films like Judas and the Black Messiah depicting the assassination of Fred Hampton, while also featuring rappers on the soundtrack like Jay-Z, who is a staunch capitalist and literally will wear blood diamonds on him and his wife's neck in a video, but still claim that they're like black nationalists or whatever. We also see biopics like the recent Bob Marley One Love, which has been criticized by especially the Jamaican community for the lead actor in it being cast to play Bob Marley, and he's not Jamaican. Films like Stonewall, which came out a number of years ago, which famously depicts the Stonewall riots, the beginnings of the queer liberation movement, where in New York at Stonewall Inn, police came in and started harassing, and communities resisted, and trans people resisted and threw the first brick. This movie shows a white guy instigating the riot. People can weaponize their identities in order to make money when it is convenient for them. They don't want to stick up for the messier or more radical parts of that history. It isn't aligned with what Hollywood wants. This biopic is very much an Oscar grab or an awards grab from him. Co-optation serves capitalism. When we co-opt histories, we reduce the complexity of them. We shut off the masses from having a more complex understanding of the past and why people resisted, why they were critical about the things that were happening in their time and place in human history. And it leads to historical erasure. It leads to historical reductionism. There are so many signs of oncoming fascism and censorship, whether it be book bannings or teachers being forced to snitch on their students for using correct pronouns for them. The state is trying to intervene in how we learn about culture, how we learn about identity, and whether or not we have a clear understanding of what's happened to us on a historical level. And so these biopics, when done poorly, actually aid the state. They aid the elite. They aid white supremacy because they give us a false understanding of history that makes us more complicit to the status quo of the present.
Everybody
works the way he can work. I must point out, though, too, that I've been working in the last few years between assassinations. That doesn't make it any easier either. I mean, they're killing my friends. It's as simple as that. And I've been all the years that I've been alive. For no reasons which have any validity.
Why don't you just want to get away somewhere and sit down and write your books? Why don't you want to do that?
Because I'm better than that.
But you don't have to be better than that.
Oh, I do.
So you don't agree then? I mean, when people say, oh, it's okay for him, he's escaped.
What have I escaped?
Close your eyes and imagine that the year is 1968. You're James Baldwin and you have just been commissioned to write a new screenplay adaptation of Malcolm X's autobiography. This is a source of conflict for you because your friend and comrade Malcolm X has just passed away within the last number of years. So has another friend and beloved comrade, Medgar Evers. But during the writing of this script, James Baldwin was sitting down at a hotel in Hollywood, California, when he received word that Martin Luther King had been assassinated as well. Roughly a year after being commissioned for this script, Baldwin fell apart. He felt that death and mortality was all around him. And what did it mean to make a script with a studio that wanted to change it constantly and reorient the confession that Baldwin felt he had to make about these slain loved ones like Malcolm X, like Martin Luther King? What does it mean to make a cinematic project about someone that has passed? And what responsibility does the artist have? And for Baldwin, this responsibility was tenfold because he knew Malcolm X and he knew how the Hollywood machine was already trying to mutilate and change this script towards something that would sanitize Malcolm X's legacy. Eventually, Baldwin reached a breaking point and he was sent to the hospital. His friends were worried. As Baldwin says in No Name in the Street, the Hollywood gig did not work out because I did not wish to be a party to a second assassination. What might Baldwin think of a biopic being made today by the likes of Billy Porter, who is a known Zionist? The answer is still back in 1968, and that's what we're going to spend this video exploring. In this edition of Putting an End to James Baldwin Nostalgia, I want to talk about how James Baldwin's reaction to the biopic that he was attempting to write a screenplay for in 1968 gives us evidence today about how Hollywood sanitizes Black radical figures like James Baldwin, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Fred Hampton to make award season fodder like Rustin, Bob Marley One Love, the new Amy Winehouse biopic, and why this is so insidious and the effect that this can have on the artist and the effect that it had on James Baldwin. For those that don't know, Billy Porter, as far as 2023, announced that he is slated to co-produce, co-write, and lead act in a forthcoming biopic about James Baldwin. This has been the source of a lot of controversy for many people. Some people say that Billy Porter does not have the acting range, his support of the state of Israel, and signing subsequent letters after October 7, 2023 to support the state of Israel's response to Palestinian people. All of these are sources of conflict, and I've spoken a lot about this on my TikTok, which you should check out, and I also have another video kind of breaking down the general problems with Billy Porter's interview where he reveals himself as a Zionist and capitalist. Since I've been reading a lot more Baldwin lately, I stumbled upon No Name in the Street, which is one of Baldwin's later collections where he talks about various aspects of racial, cultural, and social identity. In this, he opens up with talking about how this endeavor to make a screenplay about Malcolm X's autobiography, and to kind of set the tone, it's 1968, it's the end of the civil rights movement. Plenty of people are questioning whether or not nonviolence as far as Martin Luther King's strategy is sufficient, and this debate between nonviolent resistance and violent resistance has been in the mainstream media largely through the images and visions and ideologies of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. Near the end of Malcolm X's life, he was coming to terms with the fact that there needed to be a greater diversity of tactics beyond the sort of Black nationalism and sort of violent direct action tactics that he was advocating for. Malcolm X was assassinated, and this led to efforts to have a screenplay made about him. James Baldwin had a great love for Malcolm X, and in David Lemming's biography, it reads of their relationship. Because of his work on the film, Baldwin had by now closely identified with Malcolm and thought of him as a soulmate. As early as their meeting on the 1961 radio program with Eric Goldman, they had joined forces in a verbal attack on the conservative George Schuyler of the Pittsburgh Courier, to whom whose middle-class Negro attitudes, they had had similar reactions. Baldwin's mother and brother David, one had once worked at a party in New York with the Schuyler's daughter, Philippa, had played piano. The Baldwin-Malcolm alliance that was forged in the early 60s was built on an understanding that they were clearly coming from the same place from which King, a college-educated member of the Southern bourgeois, just as clearly like Schuyler did not come. Baldwin and Malcolm shared a temperament and an anger that was based in self-education and the deprivation of the northern ghettos. Baldwin felt a lot of affinity towards Malcolm X. He wrote about how he had such a respect for him that respect was indistinguishable from love. You can see it in the style of debating that they had, how they were both very fierce on an outward level, but to many people that knew them, they were soft or could be soft. They could be charming. They could light up a room. These similarities, like when Malcolm X passed away, cast a very large shadow over James Baldwin, and you can see this shadow in the documentary I Am Not Your Negro. You can also see it in the screenplay that he attempted to write that I Am Not Your Negro is based on, and you can also see it in the Malcolm X script that James Baldwin wrote that later was turned into a book. James Baldwin is attempting to write this screenplay that is heavily lyrical, that has a lot of thematic undertones. While he is writing this script, there are basically two general sides of the story in this history. One version of the history is what James Baldwin has written about, which is that he was working on this script, sending in scenes to his collaborator with the studio, and eventually the studio wanted to peel things back a little bit. They didn't want James Baldwin to have any significant mention of the Nation of Islam. They also didn't want James Baldwin to mention Malcolm X's pivotal trip to Mecca that shifted his perspective on Black nationalism and turned him more towards a sort of internationalist approach to organizing that would involve a diversity of tactics. This, of course, angered James Baldwin because he believed that if you're going to make a film about someone like Malcolm X, especially so shortly after his death, it should be reflective of a complex and full reality. This eventually brought more conflict between him and the studio, and eventually the studio hired Arnold Pearl to help rewrite various parts of Baldwin's script. He didn't like that this editor was turning his script into something that the lyricism and power behind what he was writing was being stripped away, because Baldwin had major critiques of how Hollywood tended to use violence gratuitously on the silver screen in order to shock audiences, not to actually give audiences a deeper relationship with that violence. Months go by as James Baldwin is working on this script, and eventually on April 4th, 1968, he's sitting poolside where he's staying in Hollywood. David Lemming's biography goes on to read, on April 4th, 1968, having spent most of the day being interviewed about his problems with Columbia Pictures, Baldwin was sitting by the Palm Springs swimming pool with Billy D. Williams having a drink and listening to an Aretha Franklin record when David Moses called to say that Martin Luther King Jr. had been shot. Of course, Martin Luther King's death horrifies so many around the country and the world. Baldwin notably writes about going to Atlanta to attend the funeral, essentially being traumatized by the suit that he has to wear, which weeks or months before he wore to a different event with Martin Luther King Jr. The end of the civil rights era is really when you kind of get to see a break in Baldwin's kind of optimism. He's been pushed out of the March on Washington in many ways. He's been berated by people in the Black Panther Party, and now another great figure who symbolizes a better chance for America has just been killed. This all drives Baldwin over the edge. He is battling with Columbia Records. He's looking at the state of the world. He is upset that he has to go to another funeral. This all pushes Baldwin to the edge, and he eventually takes a large number of sleeping pills, taking an attempt on his life once again, and he is rushed to the hospital. He is committed to walking away. He walks away from Columbia Pictures with his own individual script in hand, and he ends up in Istanbul, where he tries to continue working on this script. By many, many accounts throughout James Baldwin's life, and his own accounts, and numerous biographies, and my own experience in Saint-Paul-de-Vence, France, he drank a lot. It made it difficult for him to work. That is why Columbia Records brought in an outside person to help him collaborate on the script. And even when James Baldwin was away in Istanbul trying to work on this screenplay, Soul on Ice by Eldridge Cleaver was published, and James Baldwin read this and found the famous section in it where Eldridge Cleaver basically berates Baldwin for being a queer Black man that has had sexual relations with men, and not only men, but white men, which is effectively one of the worst things to Cleaver, which is definitely a dog whistle of some Black men podcasting type behavior. And Baldwin would later on notably write about his experience with Hollywood and how it scarred him in a piece titled "The Price May Be too high. Baldwin writes, "The question is not whether black and white artists can work together. Artists need each other, despite all these middlebrow rumors to the contrary. The question is whether or not black and white citizens can work together." Later on in the same paragraph, he writes, "What they are rejecting is that the American system, which make pawns of white men and victims of black men, and which really at the bottom considers all artistic effort to be irrelevant or threatening." I love reading through James Baldwin so much because he always has these incisive lines, which really at the bottom considers all artistic effort to be irrelevant or threatening. And if you haven't watched my last video on Billy Porter, I want to point out that in Porter's interview with The Guardian, he notes many times that it is important for queer black stories to be on screen. It's important to understand what these studio executives want. It's important to understand that stories aren't black or white or yellow, that the color is green. We have to understand green. And what Porter is asserting again and again is that queer capitalism and identity politics can matter above all else as long as we have representation, no matter what that representation is. And if we are folding stories to fit what the elite want, what studio executives want, like Baldwin's life and this Malcolm X biopic shows, there is this process of things being diluted. There is this process of things being erased. There are so many political ties and connections in Hollywood that when a true radical artist comes to the table and tries to tell an honest story, they will get pushback. So to argue otherwise, that you need to change history and the way that we talk about it in order to make something palatable, it literally goes against what James Baldwin believes in. That this Hollywood system wants to make all artistic effort either irrelevant. You make a film about James Baldwin that reduces all of his internationalism, that doesn't talk about his pro-Palestine stances, and that talks about how he was maybe involved in the civil rights movement. That's one version of James Baldwin that is totally irrelevant to what the current political condition needs. The threatening version of James Baldwin is one that told white people what it was like. Which version challenges the status quo? And which version does Hollywood want? And there are so many emotional discrepancies in how Baldwin was considering telling this story. And one of the biggest ones that is written about in an academic article, that's titled Lost and Found, James Baldwin's script and Mike Lee's Malcolm X. In this piece, the writer Dr. Miller talks extensively about the different considerations that went into James Baldwin's version of the Malcolm X script and Spike Lee's version of the Malcolm X script, which was eventually made in 1992, starring Denzel Washington. Dr. Miller writes, "This change in emphasis marks one of the many distinctions between the film and Baldwin's script, but it indicates succinctly how the perspectives of the two men diverged. Even though Spike Lee reads the autobiography through the lens of Baldwin's script, he loses something crucial in the process. The subtlety of Baldwin's tender rendition of Malcolm X's life is eclipsed by Spike Lee's polemical excesses. Hollywood is no place for confessions, yet given the power of film to shape the perceptions of African American identity, especially in the 1990s, when Lee, as well as other black filmmakers such as John Singleton and Ernest R. Dickerson, reached a new level of prominence by depicting the black experience against a backdrop of street violence. Baldwin's confession needs to be heard." And Baldwin had other considerations. And what I think is fascinating when we dig into these backgrounds and histories is that we get to see all of the real and tangible creative and political considerations that Baldwin was taking into account when he was considering writing this biopic about Malcolm X. He was considering the white gaze and elite influence of Columbia Records. He was considering how to portray the fullness of this man's life and how to get across both his rage and ability to debate and be antagonistic, but also his love and vulnerability and the way that Malcolm X knew how to connect with people. All of the unsaid secrets and whispers about the Nation of Islam and Malcolm X, and how Malcolm X was being surveyed by the state and both the Nation of Islam in the weeks and months leading up to his death. What this movie would mean in the long run, how he wanted it to be a reference point, what he wanted it to say, how he wanted it to be a challenge to audiences, because if they could be challenged by Malcolm X and still believe that a better America was possible, which is a hope that is now dashed by all of these leaders being killed, what art and ideas and depictions of these histories do we have to offer that are going to give an honest depiction of this reality before it is swept away by the next tragedy, the next president, or the next oncoming massacre? And I can say I am interested in what some of the material differences between these scripts and projects are. I watched the Malcolm X film in 2020 for the first time, and about a year and a half ago, I got James Baldwin's book version of the screenplay that he wrote about Malcolm X. I think it's titled One Day I Was Lost. Watching the Spike Lee Biopic. I didn't love the first act. I really liked the second act. I thought the third act was fucking brutal. And I do agree with this academic paper's assertions about how Spike Lee was going for something different. He opens the film with images of Rodney King being beaten. The film comes out in 1992. There's obviously the context of the 90s to bring us into more contemporary Black audiences being interested. And by 1987, Baldwin had passed away. And so I do think it's interesting that they were trying to do different things, but I agree with Baldwin's assertion that sometimes violence is used gratuitously. But I can say, watching the Malcolm X film, the violence did feel gratuitous, especially during his assassination scene, but it felt honest. I do wonder sometimes with Baldwin's poeticism, which he's been criticized for throughout, especially his later works, you kind of have to question, like, yes, Baldwin's script probably would have been better, but would the poeticism have kind of detracted from certain political assertions that could have been made? I mean, one big thing about Baldwin is that he was really against like being a stringent ideologist or really being tied to a certain political party or organization. One of the big reasons he argued a lot with one of his first best friends in New York, Eugene Worth, was that Eugene was a staunch socialist. Eugene had a kind of agenda or an idea about how to push for liberation. Baldwin kind of thought about ideologies in similar ways that he thought about racial and cultural identity. I mean, yes, identity is real, but it boxes in. Conflict is interesting because in the later years of the civil rights movement, when the youth are turning away from nonviolence and they want more ideological approaches and they want more tactical approaches, you can kind of see why it makes sense that Baldwin would kind of struggle to stay relevant, why younger people would kind of be like, this old man is trying to be on this nonviolent shit and we're trying to go to the CVS down the road, you know what I mean? I wonder how much of Malcolm X's politicality would have really come through in a way that maybe a more hardline political activist who would write this script would depict Malcolm X as. And this is also with a grain of salt, because I've read maybe like 1/3 of James Baldwin's script. What an artist brings to a project, especially when depicting a radical person's life, is very, very vital. I think if you're going to write a biopic or a screenplay of a radical or revolutionary's life, you should understand how to depict their politics in a way that is symbolic of what they actually believed in. And we're looking at Billy Porter trying to write a screenplay about James Baldwin and saying, I don't care what he thought about the Middle East. I don't care about all that Palestine stuff, all that terrorist stuff. I care about what he thought about the civil rights. Oh, it's so bad. It's so bad. It's so bad. And you can see in I'm Not Your Negro and definitely in The Devil Finds Work that he writes extensively about what film and cinema and media means in terms of our cultural and historical imagination. And I would argue that today, if a queer capitalist like Billy Porter wants to write about James Baldwin in a way that is palatable to the white elite and gatekeepers that are at the top of these studios, he is also doing the work of white supremacy, because you're erasing history in a way that serves what white people want people to think about history. They want James Baldwin to just be to the mountain. And I'm like, that he was not just, I think this is what a lot of people don't really understand about art spaces and being an artist and being politicized, is that when you feel deeply and put it into your art, trauma is also felt deeply and can be put into art, and sometimes can be difficult to put into art. I remember a few years ago doing an artist residency and fleeing 2 weeks in after the administration tried to treat this artist like shit. And I was in Trump country, Florida. It's a special kind of pain and suffering that I don't think people understand. And knowing James Baldwin as someone who was so insensitive, so incisive, I can only imagine how traumatizing this was, alongside it being about people that he knew dying at the hands of the state, dying at the hands of violence, while also actively trying to make the world better. I think Hollywood needs to learn how to treat people better. We can look at what's happening now with Quiet on the Set premiering and the treatment of child stars, and how once you reach a certain level of fame, or the elite think that a story can serve them in some profit-driven way, it shuts us off from having a more complex understanding of reality, a more complex understanding of our own suffering. How the evils of historical revisionism pushed Baldwin over the edge. What is our responsibility as artists from a certain culture or background in defending that culture or background's history? What do we do when we feel like we have failed? What is our responsibility, whether individually or collectively? He tried his best, and there were so many ways that I think all sorts of systems failed him, and I've written about it extensively, and I want to continue to dig into it more. These systemic failures are kind of erased when we mythologize people and say, like, they were so great and they fought so much and they did so many amazing things. How could they have been helped more? Queer trauma can be such a fuel for LGBTQIA or queer people. And queer trauma can come across as the heteronormativity that we've been raised with, the gender politics that has been forced onto us, the double standards around the heterosexual or the straight community versus how LGBTQIA people, gay people, queer people are judged, and how all of these things can make us feel displaced in a world that we've been born into. Billy Porter published a memoir in 2021 called Unprotected, and this memoir was really acclaimed. There are numerous good reviews on it online. A lot of the reviews speak about Billy Porter's candor, his vulnerability, his unflinching honesty about the trauma and the obstacles that he went through in the industry. And I think it also makes sense that this book came out in 2021, because I imagine that Billy Porter was probably writing this in 2019, 2020, reacting to the times, reacting to the pandemic, and how in a lot of ways 2020 was a big moment for a lot of different people to have the time to step back and reflect. So it does make sense that he's writing this memoir. There is a New York Times review of Porter's book, and I'll just read a few excerpts from it. Porter grew up in a Pittsburgh Hills district where he attended a homophobic Pentecostal black church that nonetheless stoked him in a devotion to performance. It goes on to say, Porter's talents propelled him to great heights. He made his Broadway debut in Miss Saigon when he was 21 years old, but the actor found that both in church and on stage, he was embraced for what he could do with his voice while simultaneously rejected for who he was about black gay man. And then it goes on to state again, elsewhere, he reflects on his career's highs and lows, like finding himself homeless and bankrupt after early successes, notably as Teen Angel in Greece, left him lost in the wilderness that he memorably dubs his millennial coon show era. I've read probably the first 3 chapters, and I tried to pull from as much as I could. I plan to read more and dig into this more. I spent time reading through different parts of this book yesterday, and I wanted to pull apart some quotes from it and analyze it. So one quote is earlier on in the book, probably around chapter 2 or 3. And this, Billy Porter is in middle school, I believe. And this is a new school in a predominantly black neighborhood. And niggas are messing with him. They're planning to play games. They're trying to mess with Porter. And this is what happens. Wanting to mess with me, Porter says, I told my mom not to pick me up, so I would have to walk past them by myself. This is in reference to the bullies. I summoned all the courage I had and made myself move in their direction, keeping my gaze on the ground as I drew near, and then suddenly, with no warning, the tall boy shoved me hard. I slammed into the ground and tumbled down the hill. I tried to stop myself but couldn't. The world, a blur of grass and sky and dirt, and even with the confusion of my panic and pain, I was aware of the laughter floating down around me. All the other kids, it seemed, were ridiculing me, hooting and hawing and snickering, and bam! The left side of my face banged to the bottom of the steel-spoked fence. After several days' seconds, I tried to gather myself and rise, but I couldn't. I was stuck in place, impaled like an insect on a pin. And then later on, after this, Billy Porter wakes up in the hospital, basically has to admit to his mother that he is being bullied, and has to go through this process of people in his family saying, turn the other cheek. And this other family member is kind of like, stand up for yourself. And he's really given this Christian ideology of these kids don't know what they mean. And they're like trying to like spread lies on you, XYZ. So when Porter wakes up in the hospital, no one there likes me, Porter says. They call me names. They wanted to beat me up. What's the names they calling you? Wimp, pussy, sissy, Porter says. Mommy looked away for a moment, her lips pursed and her gaze turned inward. I could tell she was trying to find the right words to say, and then suddenly they seemed to come to her, for resolve came into her eyes, and her gaze found mine again. They crucified Jesus, baby. You'll be fine. There was only one place in the world where people looked at me with approval, admiration, and even respect. That blessed place was Friendship Baptist Church Choir. My first solo had happened when I was 5 at the annual Easter Sunday pageant, where I sang His Eyes is on the Sparrow in my clear and open-throated gospel boy soprano. That day had been a revelation. As I stood in front of that sanctuary and let the song come through me, I had watched a ripple go through the congregation like an electric current. Everything had changed when I sang. Something shifted in the adults around me and changed the very air in the room. The fear and the shame left the grown-ups' eyes, and they all praised what they saw. And then Porter goes on to say that in various productions, theater shows that he was in, he faced all sorts of racism, all sorts of microaggressions, having songs not adjusted to his vocal range, not being offered certain parts, being criticized because of the way that he spoke. This memoir is very much a distillation of Porter's trauma. And partway through the book, you can actually read that Porter says, like, it's time for me to let go of my trauma. It's time for me to let go of the past and move forward towards something else. But when we're looking at this question of queer trauma, of resilience, of Black progress, where does all of this actually lead to? And what do we do once we claim that we faced our trauma?
And also positioning the storytelling in a way where we can talk about healing, especially for Black queer men, especially for anybody Black and queer, especially for anybody queer, especially for anybody who feels like they're an outcast, especially for anybody, ... who can read this book and be freed.
Another part of this memoir that I think is really significant and necessary to mention is that Porter speaks about his experience with sexual assault at a young age. What is really intense and interesting and sad when we look at this is that Porter was eventually able to confront his mother about this abuse. Porter eventually left home, went to college, studied in the theater, studied in the arts, and throughout the memoir, he says again and again, the arts saved me. The arts is where I could be seen. The arts is where I felt like I could be respected or my voice mattered. And during his college years, his mother calls home and says, basically, your family member, his family member is sick. Porter says, I don't really want to talk about this person because they're the person that abused me. And when I was reading this account, I was kind of like, oh, this sounds really kind of familiar. And when you watch Pose, when you watch the last season, the Take Me to Church episode, Billy Porter's character, Pray Tell, returns home, confronts his religious trauma, confronts the underlying abuse of his childhood, confronts these disjointed identities and how he needed to make peace with them. So I'm editing right now, and one major thing that I want to mention in this video, as a writer, as a memoirist, I was deeply fascinated by the parts of Billy Porter's book that I read. And granted, I still need to read the whole thing. I've read like the first 5 chapters, but I will say this. In this topic of queer trauma and where it leads us in artistry and expression, I do think the things that people write and the purposes they serve, that meaning is generated both through the act of what you write, it's generated through the act of that art being able to engage with the public, and it's also generated by the artist's actions after that artwork goes into the world. Are you expressing a series of values in your artwork that don't match up with your real life? And what does it mean to be a queer artist, to express queer history, which is complex, which has people that align with capitalism or heteronormativity or internalized homophobia? What can we detect in a work? And what is the point of a radical narrative? What is the point of a queer narrative, of a subversive narrative? Can there be queer narratives that aren't subversive, or are they inherently subversive? Why or why not? This is why the topic of assimilation and capitalism is so important, because I do think there have been periods of time throughout our cultural history where queer narratives were probably considered way more subversive, and now it's kind of like it can be Billy Porter kissing Joe Biden's hand at the White House. And so I'm also just interested in the idea of crafting our own narrative around trauma, and when we're being honest and how we're being honest about what part. Are we actually healed, or is this just marketing? This is why I thought Pose was such an interesting and beautiful, if not perfect, show. There were numerous actors and actresses in the show that were kind of given license to have episodes that could express and help them work through some of the trauma of their background. The character, Electra Evangelista, she had a whole episode exploring her family and the Caribbean trauma and having come out as trans. And when you think about Pose as a vehicle for these actors and actresses being able to confront their trauma, it makes it a much more interesting case for queer and LGBTQI representation. And I think this is even more interesting with all of the criticisms of Pose and the production, the criticisms of Ryan Murphy and the call outs against him for pay. The fact that on other sets that Ryan Murphy did, that the actress Angelica Ross stated how transphobic Emma Roberts was. And then when we dig into the Pose element even more, there's the element that Billy Porter was in hot water for basically saying, I have worked so hard to have my career. These other stars on the show, these other like LGBTQI people should just be grateful that there's representation. Like, we just don't know how to be happy for a good thing. How do you get from escaping a tumultuous home life to performing in the arts, performing in Hollywood, to being of acclaim and respected for the representation that you offer, all while seemingly denigrating other people on some level? And I think the answer is complicated. If Porter claims that he is leaving his past and his trauma behind, what else is he leaving behind along with this pain and trauma? Is Porter leaving behind an allegiance to other Black people, other Black LGBTQIA people, other Black folks that are denigrated and disenfranchised, especially in Hollywood and the entertainment industry, in ways that he might not even understand? Is there room for him to advocate for other people while also advocating for himself? And why does Porter's individual idea of success equal being at the White House during Juneteenth, kissing Joe Biden's hand, aligning with the state of Israel, denigrating those in the Middle East, not being able to speak clearly to the complexities of our Black histories, but being able to speak about how he lost his house and how he wasn't being hired as much and how he didn't make fuck you money? And so once again, I bring this back to my point that I made in my other video. It's important to note what we leave behind when we're processing our trauma. It can be so easy to think that processing our trauma and healing means that the collective struggle is done. And that is not the case, which is why we're going to dig into queer trauma next. Representation is only going to matter more and more, because in this dangerous era of the internet age, of disinformation, of co-optation, identity will only matter more and more, because the further that we're able to mutilate identity, the more we're able to sway away from the truth and turn towards spectacles of violence and storytelling that inoculate us into a false sense of history and also a very reduced idea of what these identities are in the first place. And that's the reason that these bad biopics are on the rise. If identity is a sort of category that the entertainment industry and production companies can tap into in order to target and profit off of a certain kind of demographic, that is one level of co-optation. Inauthentically using people's identities to tell stories that will get that demographic into those seats, buying tickets, and potentially raising millions of dollars is not that far off from the entertainment industry's recent desire to shovel out a shit ton of bad biopics
on Broadway stage clothes. And I know this outfit is supposed to be like she's a strong Black leader, but she looks like she's about to dead-ass challenge Picasso to a paint-off.
And this is kind of the conundrum of the built-in audience and what capitalism assumes. If you have a famed figure like Elvis, who has had a decades-long career, is considered one of the greatest musicians of all time, is going to be considered an intergenerational icon, no matter where you are in terms of like modern human history. It makes sense for a production company to dump a bunch of money into a project to find a lead actor, a A-level actor, or a B-list actor, and put them in that movie, because that built-in fan base is going to be an assumed profit for that project. And this is why biopics can be dangerous, because biopics are they are an opportunity to authentically depict, or at least carefully depict, a certain kind of history. And since biopics are so aligned with identity, since you can't make a Selena biopic without like really delving into Latinx culture and the complexities of Latinx American identity. So when we're looking at biopics and the ways that they're being made and how they are the merging of this sort of co-optation and mutilization of identity in the mainstream Hollywood system, along with how biopics become this built-in audience for a certain icon's demographic and their cultural background, we can see why these bad biopics are a decent bet for these production companies. And when I say decent bet, I don't mean like it's a good bet. In a world where identity is further and further being assimilated into the internet, the social age, into disinformation, into hot takes, and where is the nuance? And that's why this question of trauma is also interesting, because if you look at biopics, they're usually subjects that are considered tragic individuals, people that died too soon, people that offered so much but were offered so little back. If we look at the Harvey Milk biopic, which was played by Sean Penn, a white actor, Harvey Milk was an activist who advocated for LGBTQIA rights in San Francisco, who ran for government, who won and was eventually gunned down. Why is it that this biopic is both a commemoration of the spectacle of violence, but also can be considered a historical document? Let's look at Nina Simone's biopic, which was famously criticized for having Zoe Saldana play a lead role, a lighter-skinned person of color playing Nina Simone, who is a dark-skinned Black woman. I even read in researching that they darkened her skin tone. They had to add prosthetics onto her. And eventually, years later, Zoe Saldana apologized. If we look at the Elvis biopic that came out a few years ago, I mentioned this, I walked out of that movie, I fucking hated it. But the Elvis biopic totally ignored all of the mainstream criticism about Elvis literally being coercive towards a minor and then eventually marrying her. But then they could show him going to a Black church and, having the Holy Spirit. Why not? In this discussion of bad biopics, I think we have to understand that when capitalists are put at the helm of telling stories about our histories, especially more subversive, radical, or marginalized histories, we have to account for the fact that it's the job of capitalism, of white supremacy, of colonization, of historical erasure to sanitize these histories to make them more palatable for wider audiences. If you're making a Black radical movie about James Baldwin, best believe there are going to be entire audiences of people that are not going to be into that because it's going to be too abrasive to them. If you're making an intense movie about and so there is this contradiction of how do you make a radical narrative about a radical history that is more palatable to a modern audience that isn't privy to the complexities of that history. And they often lead to spectacles of violence without meaningful conversations about why these histories happened, how these histories have led to our present moment, and why those spectacles of violence in the past are deeply and intimately connected to the spectacles of violence that we are seeing today. What does it mean to struggle for representation in a culture and a political world that is financially incentivized to erase us? And how do we oppose this erasure? And I found this article that is out there with the Cato Institute titled "Capitalism, Not Socialism, Led to Gay Rights." Okay, this piece reads, once capitalism created the opportunity for people to live autonomously, it unwittingly allowed LGBT people to privilege homosexual desire as a driving force in their lives. Despite his left leanings, D'Amelio saw the world more clearly than Downs does. All the advances in human rights that we've seen in American history, abolitionism, feminism, civil rights, gay rights, stem from our founding ideas of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The emphasis of the individual mind in the Enlightenment, the individualist nature of market capitalism, and the demand for individual rights that inspired the American Revolution naturally led people to think more carefully about the nature of the individual and gradually to recognize the dignity of individual rights should be extended to all. This doesn't make any fucking sense to me. To say the advances in human rights that we've seen in human history, abolitionism, feminism, civil rights, gay rights, stem from our founding ideas of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those founding ideas of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness were the literal reason that white people and colonizers justified slavery. They said that my white life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness can be at the expense of these indigenous people, at the expense of these Black people. And so to purport that all of these things stem from, like the founding documents. The founding documents were literally made by people that owned slaves. And this queer trauma and how it shoves us towards capitalism can be really important, because I also found a Washington Post piece also mentions it. Billy Porter also mentions this in his book. But essentially, like, if folks have seen my Malcolm X biopic video, James Baldwin tried to write a biopic about Malcolm X after his assassination. There's a very interesting history here. So in that video, I explained that first James Baldwin was supposed to make that movie, hated the process of it, fled it. Then years later, Spike Lee was brought on to make that movie. In Billy Porter's memoir, he mentions auditioning for this film and being called out by Spike Lee specifically. This is page 143 of Unprotected. The not black enough trope was something I was used to hearing in my life. From the moment I started talking, I spoke in a complete and clear sentences, forging the normalization of black slang, or what was commonly called ebonics. You talk like a white boy, kids will bully. Damn, come to think of it, I even got that shit from adults. When I was just starting out in New York, film director Spike Lee made a point to call me out at an audition for his seminal masterwork, Malcolm X. Why are you talking like that? He irritably snarked at me with disdain. Talk like what? I clapped back before I could even think about my tone. You talk like a white boy, Lee said back. And there you have it. I talk like I talk. I've always talked like this. Why do black people hate me so much? Why do they associate my speaking the Queen's English with denying my blackness? When did intelligence become something to be mocked and shamed for? So now, here I was again with a black man clowning me for not tap dancing black enough. And I really have to end this video off on saying that when I read this, I can almost understand. And here's what is interesting. Here's what's intense. The fact that Billy Porter is making a biopic about James Baldwin is interesting and almost fitting, if not also entirely misguided. Because if you've seen my James Baldwin video on his conversation with Nikki Giovanni, you can see that in James Baldwin's body of work and his rhetoric, there is a lot missing in terms of his gender politic and how he represents, talks about, and respects the plight of the black woman. That is something I will never deny. I want to dig into it more. It's something important because I think it's something missing in the critiques against James Baldwin. In that video, I basically purport that Baldwin is saying that his trauma as a black man should matter more than black women's trauma because black men are the backbone of our community. And what Billy Porter is saying, we can kind of see a sort of similar longing, because in James Baldwin's lifetime, he was constantly rejected by black men, torn down by Eldridge Cleaver, had shit talked about him by the Black Panther Party. There is this long-standing homophobia that James Baldwin had to deal with that Billy Porter also had to deal with. You can see it here in his descriptions of his bullying growing up, in the homophobic context of his religious background. You can see it in the way the media and the industry and other black people treated him. Even in this, in the language that I read, Porter is essentially saying, when people criticize me for talking this way, they're criticizing me for talking intelligent. And Porter's response, I grew up with it. I talk how I talk. People can easily say, you talk white, you don't care about black people, blah, 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 blah. I've learned enough about my blackness to know that this is a fucking lie. I've also studied enough of my black history. I've also studied enough queer history, anarchist history, radical history to know that when other black people say this, it's their idea of blackness that they're projecting onto you. But what I think is interesting, starting there and where it leads you, there are these different paths. And we can see that James Baldwin went abroad, engaged in all different kinds of cultures, struggled to write, struggled to connect with like the hypermilitarism that came out of the post-civil rights era, struggled to connect with other black people. But James Baldwin always seemed to have this deep desire to be legible to other black people, even if that legibility largely was the desire to be legible to other black men.
It looks like a black man can't make it with a black woman. If somebody looks at the two of us, man, we're the weirdest looking people on earth because you went your way and I went my way, which is saying the same thing. And that's sort of a shame to say
Nikki,
that I can't have a black man standing with me and you can't have a black woman, because we wouldn't be who we are if we had. And that's a fact.
But Nikki, we are, nevertheless, we are here, we met.
Oh, you and I met. But I'm talking about for the statement, man. You're looking like a Huey Newton.
Yeah.
He can't make it with a black. Who could be his woman?
We don't know.
Oh, it's such a shame.
We don't know that much about the man.
Which I think opens him up to many kinds of misogynistic and misogynoir adjacent arguments, sentiments, ideas, thoughts, expressions. With Billy Porter, we can see that his rejection at the hands of men and various parts of the Black community has pushed him to be in this place where, in a lot of ways, I think Billy Porter thinks he's a representation of his own. And that this representation kind of means that he's worked past all these obstacles, so other people should do it in the same way as well. That is how you gain respect. That is how you gain acclaim. But what this ignores is the vast array of discrimination still facing LGBTQIA, especially trans people. It ignores the deep connection between James Baldwin, the civil rights movement, growing sentiments among Black people who started to understand and see Israel as a force of colonial violence, and how Baldwin's trauma at least compelled him to demand a greater humanism and a greater demand for a sort of international solidarity with other marginalized people, other marginalized movements, other people in other parts of the world. And granted, you can see in James Baldwin's later years, like he was trying to write more towards the times and media and gender, and he was kind of trying to expand his kind of line of logic, although gender, of course, was missing in a lot of that in ways that I think are meaningful to Black women. In this kind of conundrum, we can see that James Baldwin attempted to use his trauma and the dissonance he felt with the Black community to dig deeper, to try to fight for relevance by further representing himself as a Black artist. You can see the shift in his later years towards wanting to be seen more as a Negro writer or as a writer who's down for the culture. Porter is afraid of losing money, wants to have the stability in the industry, also believes that other people are unjustly complaining about being locked out or not being acknowledged. And also Porter is aligned with a certain kind of colonial logic, which says my individual progress is a sign of a collective path forward. And that individual progress can be steeped in ignorance. It can be steeped in Palestinian erasure. It can be steeped in needing to align yourself with capitalists, with people like Byron Allen, who are worth millions and millions of dollars. And it really is an expression of queer individualism leading to someone being aligned with a colonial logic, a supremacist logic, a logic that is okay with other people being beneath you in order for you to get to your version of success. And the reason that I think this is so interesting and complicated and necessary for me to talk about is because when I look at James Baldwin and Billy Porter, I almost see different versions of what I could end up like, or the person I could have been. Growing up and being bullied and teased and gay bashed myself as a kid, as a teenager, I did grow up in a family that had anti-Black sentiments. And as I got older, especially as I got into college and the Black Lives Matter movement happened, I learned to shed those sentiments because not only one, did I grow up in all Black schools and I started to understand like Blackness in a different way than my family ever could. I started to also understand that the sense of progress that my family tried to feed me was always antithetical to a kind of Black collectivism. In order for you to succeed and to get your own, you have to kind of look at your community and kind of see that they're doing things wrong. And that's why like Black people collectively haven't gotten to where we need to be. And this isn't to say that this is exactly what Billy Porter is purporting or anything that like James Baldwin is purporting, but I'm talking about how individualism and the desire for one's own progress, if not done with humanism and consciousness and a deep sense of history, it can lead people to blame the victim of structural violence. And this is where I think the anti-Blackness and the individualism and the kind of turning away from the more marginalized parts of our communities can be extremely insidious, because not only is Billy Porter doing this, but he's also aligning himself with the project of Zionism. Even since October 7th, killed close to over 30,000 Palestinians, has injured over 80,000 Palestinians. And right now, Rafah, one of the last places that Palestinians have been told that they can flee to and be safe, is also being targeted. And so in this discussion of queer trauma representation, I think we have to have a real conversation with ourselves about how trauma can feed illusions that can lead us to align with colonization, with state violence, with social domination and hierarchy, when instead trauma should be a force of consciousness raising. It should be a force that encourages us to be more in community with other, to find our collective path of healing, and to use that healing to drive us towards action. And what that action can look like are LGBTQIA people coming together to tell our own versions of our histories. It can look like LGBTQIA people doing the work, whether through academia or action or through culture, to dismantle these different versions of historical erasure, to demand a more complex retelling of our own histories. And I think the fact that James Baldwin's birthday is coming up, it's August 2nd, it's his 100th birthday, all of these questions are really, really important, because when I read Baldwin, I read so much of the trauma that he was trying to work through, and some of it he did, some of it I think he was still trying to find a place to actually write about it. And I also think he dealt with mental health struggles. He dealt with ableism. He dealt with his own community in a lot of ways turning against him. And I see a similar line of logic with Porter, and I see how that line of logic is literally steering him towards the White House and kissing Joe Biden's hand. When we are analyzing, looking at our trauma, using it as fuel to move forward, our trauma should actually lead us to action, to mobilize for ourselves and to mobilize and advocate for other people. I went through a lot of shit growing up and being queer. I went through a lot of shit being queer in my Jamaican family. I went through a lot of shit being queer in the Black community, in the white community, in every fucking community. But I will be damned if my subjugation, the ways that I've been discriminated against, the ways that I've been otherized, the ways that I've suffered emotionally, psychologically, physically, I'll be damned if that leads me towards ignoring the pain and suffering of other people. And I think the ways that queerness has taught me to be subversive, it's taught me to not respect legibility. It's taught me to not respect the binary. And it's also taught me to redefine what success means for me. Because if success was supposed to be a white picket fence and a family and kids and a job and stability, what does it mean when those same systems can discriminate against you and your people, legally or not legally? And they still tell you that you need to come here because this is where the success is. And instead, what I desire are more subversive narratives in the mainstream. I desire a more complex reading of history. And I desire that LGBTQI people hold each other to task for trying to use our traumas to subjugate other people and or erase our own histories and stories, because that I will not stand for. And I will criticize Billy Porter, and I will also criticize James Baldwin, just as I will look at my own history and myself and say, how can I do better? What are the ways that I can be more aligned with liberation? And how can I use what I know to help other people learn as well? To end, we should recognize that Porter aims to represent Black progress at the expense of a deeper analysis of what has gotten us here in the first place. And what has gotten us here is capitalism, is colonization, is racial hierarchy, and this demand for individualism. And once we turn away from all of these things, we can maybe begin to seek a better path moving forward. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you got something from the many different parts of it. I'm going to continue making videos about James Baldwin, about capitalism, about media, about especially historical and political representations in media. So if there are any topics specifically related to any of these things that you're interested in, please let me know in the comments. Consider becoming a channel member so you can get early access to videos and members only videos. And consider maybe buying a James Baldwin book, or pick up a copy of my recent book, The Black Radical Reader 1, which is a collection of essays about Black figures like James Baldwin, Huey Newton, Bob Marley, and also a few different essays that really explore the necessity of Black solidarity with Palestine. So check those out. They're going to be in the they're going to be in the video description. Like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you later.